Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family and they don't belong no place. They got nothing to look ahead to.
But not us, George. Tell about us now.
Well, we ain't like that.
No.
We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for all anybody cares.
But not us, George, because I got you to look after me, but then you got me to look after. But George, tell about how it's gonna be.
Someday, we're gonna have us a little house and a couple of acres.
Okay, so if our goal is to expand a theme, then we're first going to have to start with a simple theme. And so the first step in doing that is going to be asking, what does my text say about life? Okay, this applies to every text, every piece of literature that you could create a theme statement for. But today we are working with Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So step number 2 is to move to that number 2 there that says ask a question specific to your text. So you are just going to take that step 1 ask section, right? Start with a simple theme. We're going to take ask and move it to step 2 and create a question specific to the text. So what I've decided is, what does Of Mice and Men tell me about life, right? Super simple. We just combine that title with the question. And we are going to end up doing that later when we start expanding our theme and moving down questions to add depth and complexity. So next, I'm going to move to number 3. I'm going to reason through the answer to my question. Okay, so if I'm thinking about Of Mice and Men, I'm thinking pretty much initially about the fact that all of the characters experience a type of loss. And so I put that into some language I think I might be able to use in my essay later. So I've said that all the main characters experience a loss of a dream or connection to others. Specifically, Lenny, George, and Crooks have the most dramatic losses. Okay, but now I'm thinking about that and I'm thinking, oh, most dramatic? No. Curly's wife dies, right? She gets killed. So not exactly the most dramatic, so I'm going to change that. So now I've changed it to notably dramatic losses because they are all bad, just not all of them end in death, right? Yeah, okay, so that feels better. Okay, so as we move to step 4, we want to kind of take what we've just talked about in step 3, what we've reasoned through, and find that exact text evidence to back up what we are saying and our commentary, our interpretation of Mice and Men. So I've taken 3 different quotes for this one that represent the loss of the dream for each different character that we're talking about, because that is ultimately what they can achieve, right? So when Crook says, I wouldn't want to go to no place like that after being harassed by Curly's wife, that is where he rejects his dream. When Lenny says, let's do it now, let's get that place now, that is him unknowingly about to be ripped away from that dream when George shoots him. And then George shoots Lenny, right? He shivers, looks at the gun, throws it from him. And that represents the regret, the bitterness that he feels about killing Lenny. Because that was his dream too, even though he did intentionally make that, right? And we even get into where we have these connoted items near, right? Like the old ashes, that destruction, potentially also talking about the destruction of his dream there. Yeah, and circling back around to that parallel episode at the beginning when we saw that the men were destroying this natural environment, right? Men always destroy things, yeah? So we want to now go a little bit further into the existence of the dream too, because that also is in these quotes. We have Crooks saying, just forget it. He's acknowledging that he did once have this dream. Now he wants to step away from it, right? For his own safety too. And then we have Lenny still wholly believing that this dream actually exists. So you can look at that both ways. The text evidence provides a lot of different routes for you to comment on the interpretation of this loss of dream, be it before the dream was lost or after the dream was lost. My people, we have made it to the last step. So we started step 1 with this simple theme, right? And we have to do all of this work to even come up with, in step 5, that universal theme statement. We've recorded our text evidence. We've reasoned through the answer to our questions. We've made that question specific to the text and even determined the focus of our expansion. But so we've gone through all of that already. And now we are just getting to that first initial theme that we start with. Okay? And what you're going to do is you're going to put that expansion right there in that last box, and that is going to be what can apply to everything. No matter how hard they try, the oppressed cannot better their lives. This should be consistent with the direct evidence you've pulled. This should be backed up by the commentary you provided in step 3, and then this is going to be super, super easy for you to transfer directly into a literary analysis essay. So we are finally on to step 2, and that is an expansion by causes or reasons. We have ended up with this theme statement: no matter how hard they try, the oppressed cannot better their lives. We have determined our expansion. We've asked our question, reasoned, recorded evidence, and then we came up with this. Yes, so we know that this comes from our text. It's not just our bias. This is a good start. However, it is very broad. We need to connect dots. We need to kind of work through our reasoning even more. So let's expand. So we don't want to get caught in a post hoc ergo propter hoc logical fallacy, but a good question to ask when you're thinking about causes or reasons is what comes before. It's not going to always cause what comes next, but if you are struggling with that causation component, it can be really helpful for you to just look at those events and then determine the causation. The question I've come up with for this expansion is, what comes before the oppressed failing to better their lives? That's a really awkward way of saying that, but what I really wanted to focus on is keeping the specific language from the content of the last theme that you expanded already. I didn't really want to change that a lot because it's so easy just to drag over. You don't need to rewrite everything, even if that question is just a little bit awkward, right? So I took that section, that phrase already, the oppressed, and then bettering their lives, and I tried to keep it as simple as possible. Just drag it right over. When I'm thinking through what may be causing the oppressed to not be able to better their lives, what I really seemed to focus on in the book was that they all have this social isolation, this disconnection from other people, and it's largely due to their minority status. I have my 3 focus characters again, and I've detailed each one: Lenny, George, and Crooks. And I've written a little bit about their struggles before that comes from people really just not understanding where they're coming from. So let's move on to step 4 again and get some text evidence to back this up. So I have chosen one piece of evidence for each of my focus characters again. The first one is Slim had not moved. His calm eyes followed Lenny out the door. Jesus, he said, he's just like a kid, ain't he? So in this, I really wanted to highlight Lenny's disability, and that primarily comes through the metaphor that Slim uses to describe him. Or I guess that's a simile, isn't it? The simile that he's just like a kid, ain't he? And this represents his brain functioning, the way he interacts with people, and just the amount he's able to even connect to others. Children generally can't connect to adults on the same level. They don't have the same experiences, the same memory, the same responsibility. Next, for George, I really wanted to highlight the fact that he's a migrant worker. We think of George as a more privileged person who has more control in Of Mice and Men, but he is extremely limited by the fact that he doesn't have money the entire time, right? Part of that is because he has Lenny as a responsibility, but it's also just because of the way of the migrant worker. We have that constant image of what the migrant workers do with their money when they don't have anyone to look after, when they don't have goals. They go spend it in a cat house. They waste their $50. And this lets us know that even while making smart choices for him and Lenny, George still cannot bust through that poverty ceiling like other characters have, like the boss or Curly, who can do whatever he wants, right? The third one is for Crooks. And while Lenny and George have extremely emotional and mental displacements from the rest of society, the other characters, and from each other, Crooks takes it to another level. Being black, his racial inequity he experiences is really what not only displaces him emotionally from the guys, but that emotional displacement is caused by the physical segregation of being black in the 1930s. He cannot be in the same room, and they use his race to essentially attack his self-worth, which he totally internalizes. When you read anything he says in chapter 4, it's amazing. It's not amazing, but it's very intricate and interesting and well done. So that is what I really wanted to highlight with this quote. The fact that they physically don't allow him into their space, and he therefore has that emotional wall up because of the social division. So as we come to step 5 in the second expansion, I've come up with, no matter how hard they try, the oppressed cannot better their lives due to social isolation. This I just stole directly from my step 3. Do not rewrite the book with this. Make it easy on yourself. You can always reword things in your essay later to add variety in your phrasing. However, if you're someone who struggles just to put pen to paper and get your thoughts down, don't try to do it multiple times. And I took from that first, starting with the simple theme, look at how I just moved that down. We are not trying to completely rearrange everything. You're going to have way too many ideas to deal with, way too many things that you're going to need to take out, add in, and prioritize. Just make it simple. Just add on. Moving on, we are talking about expansion by effects or results. So I'm asking what happens after, again, avoiding that post hoc fallacy, but if that's something you're struggling with, it might be very helpful for you to identify the things that do happen after a significant event or whatever your focus is, and then you can kind of go through and identify what's actually the effect of that event. So I've made it kind of hard for myself in splitting up these 3 characters. And what I did here, because I was struggling to just come up with one effect, honestly, so I just split it up into 3. I named each character as what parts, what populations they could represent in society, which is not necessary, but it was something that kind of helped me broaden my thoughts more, so I did it. And then I had to go back afterward and I highlighted in yellow the patterns. Patterns are everything. That is what creates meaning, yeah? Not everything was the same, which made it hard. So I had to note all the similarities, all the results that were the same in yellow, and anything that was kind of weird or different in blue. So this is what I came up with. You don't necessarily have to do the anomalies in this section. It happened to work out for me that way. You will do anomalies later, so I'll expand on that later for you. So I'm thinking, what is that pattern then? What I came up with was a little mini theme for each of my characters based on the effects. So for Lenny, trying to better one's life leads to forced, non-consensual removal from society and life without knowledge or control over one's fate. Because George kills him, he doesn't have control over that knowledge, yada yada. For George, trying to better one's life leads to sacrifice, isolating one from a strained but desired relationship. Yes, it was hard to take care of Lenny, but ultimately he did want that connection. And then for Crooks, for the lone wolves, trying to better one's life leads to withdrawal from potential dangers accompanying interactions with the powerful. And that's where he just has to completely go back into his shell when the connections he's forming with all the guys in his bunk leads to a death threat from Curly's wife. He felt empowered in that moment, and the only way for self-preservation was to give up his power again. So the pattern I'm seeing ultimately is isolation. It is the removal of Lenny, the removal of his life, the isolation of George from Lenny after killing him. It is the withdrawal of Crooks from his friends, right? Now, I want to kind of identify now what's different and similar about all of these because they work in different ways, yeah? So I'm thinking the biggest thing I see is the fact that Lenny's removal is forced, so that's unintentional. When we see George, he sacrifices, he makes that choice. And then when we see Crooks, he very explicitly rejects the dream, rejects the guys after feeling scared for his life. So, George, intentional. Crooks, intentional. Lenny, not intentional. He does not have any intention that he carries out with to remove himself from George. He does talk about it a little bit before, like, going off into the cave, but it's not something that he actually acts on. And from chapter 6, we don't think he would actually act on that of his own accord. So really keep these patterns in mind when you are moving forward. These are going to be the most helpful for you when creating a strong analysis and interpretation. So my next expansion is going to be by qualifications or limitations. The big question to start with is what is required? It's easier to start with qualifications because we want to expand on that initial focus first instead of talking about what can limit it. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. So what is required to better one's life? I think it's easiest to start with whatever the focus topic of that simple theme is that you've just been kind of like dragging down until now. But if you want to, you could maybe expand by an effect, expand by a reason. And what I mean by that is you could qualify an effect, qualify a reason. You don't just have to qualify a portion of that simple theme. I think this is also going to help me because I've stopped adding on to my expanded theme due to the fact that I have 3 focus characters. So getting back to the basics is going to be more helpful. But ultimately, what is required to better one's life is the connection that someone makes with another person. We see the pinnacle of connection in Of Mice and Men to be the relationship between George and Lenny, even though there's a lot of struggle with that. And we also see everyone else wanting to get in on that. Candy wants to get in on it. Crooks does. Slim is also especially vocal about it. And I think another great thing to put in the evidence section in that step 4 that I didn't include would probably be Slim's consistent repetition of the fact that it's strange that George and Lenny travel around together. When he says things like, maybe everyone in this whole damn world is scared of each other. And I think that really does accurately represent how coveted and how rare George and Lenny's relationship is. So that's what we're looking for, right? There is, I guess, a little bit of a, maybe another component I could have focused on if I took a different approach in that, yes, they already have it. So maybe it's not just the relationship, but it's also stability, right? The stability of not having to be a migrant worker. But that's another story for another time. So after looking at all that text evidence and getting examples of people craving those connections, I ended up talking about the qualification of bettering one's life to be making a genuine, mutually beneficial connection with another human being. Because it's not just that you're making that connection, which was kind of my starting point, but it's also that it eliminates that power struggle on some level, right? Like, it's at least an exchange. Even though George and Lenny have power over each other in different ways, that does seem to be a little bit even. Lenny is a great marketing tool almost for George and him to get more jobs, even after they are a risk. But then George takes care of Lenny. He just couldn't even survive by himself. Moving on, I think it would be appropriate here to ask another qualifying question. So that's to expand further. What is required to make a genuine connection? So in that, I'm kind of looking at these moments of power between the people because the genuine connection is never on a wholly equal playing field. Even though I did just talk about how they even each other out, there's still some type of intersection there. So there is a little bit of risk in that. One must confront inequity of power between people. A great quote for this is Crooks's quote that's highlighted there with all of those ellipses. That shows so much hesitancy and it really conveys the risk that he is taking to put himself out there, say, I am a black man and I'm asking to desegregate myself from you in this time where I am not worth a lot because of my race. So that creates a genuine connection as well. Next, we're talking about limitations. So we are now going to kind of grow off of the idea of making a genuine connection and talk about what can limit a genuine connection. If you didn't want to expand that second qualification, you could also really just talk about what can limit bettering someone's life. You could maybe also think about what could limit confronting inequity of power. Is that fear? Is that, I don't know, it could be anything, right? That might be something else to explore. Imbalanced power is something that I've been talking about a lot, and it's very wrapped up in all the text evidence that I pulled for this section. And ultimately, as much as confronting that is the qualification for forming a genuine connection, I also am finding from my text evidence that this is the limitation of it as well. That a lot of times that confrontation does not actually disembody that imbalance of power, but it can reaffirm it. One place where this is really apparent is where Curly's wife is threatening Crooks. She closed in on him. "You know what I could do?" Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you keep your place then. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." So there she is directly referencing lynching and using his race against him, her race against him. And then other one that's very apparent is Curly, and the fact that everyone on the ranch who's a migrant worker is afraid to stand up to him, and he can essentially do whatever he wants, excepting only when he does not, for fear of losing that like masculine aggressive image that he has created for himself. So that really is his only means of not having power, is that he is not as masculine or physically strong as Lenny is, which can be used against him. So ultimately, I have come up with the limitation that imbalanced power dynamics can inhibit genuine connection. It's so funny because the imbalance and inequity of power is in both of these, the qualification and limitation, which creates this sort of conflict in complexity in our theme, which is great. And I think that's going to be an area that will offer a lot of opportunity for really nuanced analysis, especially in those commentary sections in the body paragraphs of a lit analysis essay. Now, because I've already talked about expansion by exceptions or counters, remember I did that in the second step, talking about the anomaly of Lenny not really being able to make that decision to isolate himself from the other characters. I am going to focus a little bit more here on just combining. And when we're talking about exceptions, I did already choose one that I had found in the effects, but I could also do what exceptions are there regarding genuine connection? Well, Slim and George make somewhat of a genuine connection, right? We don't really know. That might be something to explore. Imbalanced power, or maybe even like intersectional power. Like think about the intersectional power of Lenny's masculinity versus his intellectual disability. Very interesting because he is considered the most physically powerful person, but he is mentally also the weakest of the group. So there are tons of possibilities there for you. So when we're talking about our exception, we're talking about the counter argument that we have one person out of three focus characters that is not trying to really take himself out of this situation. He's just trying to figure it out. He doesn't have a choice in that. George makes that choice for him as a caretaker, as kind of the bearer of his burden, and he decides that he would be better outside of this world. It's also really interesting. I'm noticing too that I'm using the word save a lot, which is kind of another spin I wish I could have explored. So don't close yourself off to other interpretations as well, because that may have been something that I could have focused on that would have been really cool, or maybe another way if I got stuck within the expansion to take this, right? So I took some pieces of text evidence that look familiar because I've used one of them, Crooks's, several times already, but then I've also used the other two at the beginning for the effects. And that's largely because my exceptions counter is very much like my effects and results section. So now I'm really going to focus on combining. I looked at those expansions in isolation and I want to put them together. So I'm going to start out by talking about some of those qualifications, and then I'm going to go into my initial theme statement, back to qualifications, then to the reasons, then limitations, then effects, and then exceptions. There is no order for this. Just put the ideas together however it flows well. I would also really recommend doing this out loud and actually reading it. So here's what I have. Despite efforts to release fear of others' power and confront social inequity, the oppressed cannot make genuine connections with others due to the social isolation from imbalanced power dynamics. They further isolate themselves intentionally as self-preservation, if not forcibly removed from society. So, yeah, that's what I've come up with, and I think that's a pretty fluid combination of the different things that I have tackled so far. Our last expansion is really the whole reason that we do this. We are talking about social commentary. So when we want to look at this, we're looking at what does this social commentary, what does the book reveal about society itself, how society functions, how we work, what we will find as true in this communal space with our fellow people. And that should apply even though, you know, we're working like in the 1930s in California and not like 2019 in Indiana. That's okay. It's okay. It still applies, right? It still applies on some level. And what does it say that the oppressed inability to create connection despite best efforts, what does that say about society? Here is ultimately what I believe it boils down to. We've talked a lot about lost connections. What we also really lose is the farm, which is their dream. In this case, in this context, especially considering the Great Depression era, the dream equals the farm, which equals land and wealth, which equals the American dream. So we are looking at the American dream, or if you're not familiar with that, basically the idea that immigrants or disenfranchised persons can live in America and rise to prosperity and happiness through hard work. We are seeing those best efforts, and we're seeing that path to the American dream, and we're seeing that stopped, eliminated by the social inequity. So, how I have integrated this into my expanded theme statement is everything in that last box in purple, okay? So I really focused in on the fact that that American dream cannot be reached. Upward mobility is a lie. We're talking myth of meritocracy here. Look it up. It's great. So inequity of power in society creates insurmountable schisms. We're not able to get over it. We can't rise above it. Inhibiting the oppressed from forming genuine connections with their oppressors and attaining any upward mobility. Chained to their minority circumstances, so that's a struggle they can't get out of. Like, we can't say like, oh, I'm black, but I'm going to just desegregate myself. I'm a migrant worker, but I'm just going to get money and get rich. Doesn't happen that way. The oppressed will ultimately be displaced from the oppressors through intentional self-preservation or occasionally forcible removal. Although there are a lot of different ways you could take this, this is just what I wanted to focus on. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more clarity on how to expand your theme and the process that goes on behind it.